Is psychology pseudoscience? We see psychology in our daily lives. We see it in communication, where, even subconsciously, we continuously try to make sense of the context of messages and decipher gestures of the people we are talking to. Like wondering why two friends look each other funny whenever you start talking, or in school or work settings, where we understand the behavior of our peers to establish connections and foster relationships. Or sometimes even in the wee hours of the night, where we get drowned in our own thoughts and feel an empty sadness for no reason, and we badly want someone to understand. While we recognize those ideas readily, the majority fail to as readily acknowledge psychology's importance in academic fields, such as marketing, law, biology, statistics, or chemistry. We get accustomed to perceiving psychology as simply an abstract mythological like study of the soul, the objective diagnosis and interpretation of human behavior, something immeasurable and less scientific than, say, physics or chemistry. Because of that perception, many people today have been denying psychology the title science. In this speech, we will first be going over three reasons why people invalidate psychology, namely lack of rigor, the absurdity of pop conflated psychology, and faulty claims of psychology practitioners. Through this, I am taking the task today to make you see that psychology is indeed a science. To set us on the same page, let's first clarify what it takes for science to be a science. Science is, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a knowledge of a system of knowledge covering general truths of the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through the scientific method. What we call the scientific method includes objective observation, evidence, experiment, inductions, repetition, critical analysis, and verification and testing. The objective observation should be measurable and the data can be possibly, although not necessarily, be collected using mathematics. Evidence should be acquirable. There should be an experiment or observations as benchmarks for testing hypotheses. It should be replicable and contains critical analysis. It should also be verifiable and testable, with critical exposure to scrutiny, peer review, and assessment. So, according to some, psychology is not a science because it is subjective and has a non scientific nature. It studies concepts that are abstract and highly unpredictable, and thus it is often accused of being non scientific because it is prone to many biases and inconsistencies. They argue that its experiments are non verifiable, non repeatable, and terminologies used in the field are not accurate and not necessarily applicable to all people in the same way. Like, for instance, happiness. A writer from the magazine Los Angeles Times used the example of happiness research being performed in psychology. He said that the term happiness is not universal, it differs with the context. What makes one person happy does not necessarily mean it makes others happy too. We cannot study happiness using a microscope or a ruler, so psychologists created an arbitrary scale, whimsical and not suitable for the title science, according to him. But see, much in the realm of medicine is also subjective. There are no objective measures of pain, meaning that medical treatment of acute and chronic pain is simply a matter of interaction and perception between the doctor and the patient. Therefore, the most objective way to measure this is with self-assessed pain scales. The difference between other science field experiments and human behavior experiments is that while it is easy to put variables into control groups, it is not so easy to find human beings that conform to the design of the study. That said, there are plenty of experiments that require making assumptions about the control groups, just like psychology. For example, in biology, where studies must often assume the outcome of their experiment before conducting it, it is comparable to psychologists conducting a study that must assume individuals are answering survey questions honestly. Both scenarios have their fair share of confounding factors. People in the academic community undermine psychology also because it lacks scientific rigor, making it closer to the humanities than the sciences. If science isn't rigorous, it is reckless. Scientific rigor is the strict application of the scientific method to ensure a robust and unbiased experimental design and analysis of results. The rules of scientific rigor include having appropriate replicates within experiments, preferably at least in triplicate, randomization, measures to control bias, accurate statistical methods, clear terminology, and appropriate and accurate experimental design. The issue is that psychology does not meet two of these requirements, which are clear terminology and replicability. The terminologies used in psychology are not universal, such as mentioned before about the happiness research. Psychological experiments are also hard, if not impossible, to replicate because the target of the field, which is the behavior of human subject, is continuously changing. Replicability is a big issue because of the idea that replicable experiments mean consistent and truthful results, and so it fails to meet those certain requirements enough for others to disqualify it from being science. The second reason why people are so heated on discrediting psychology is because of the prevalence of pop conflated psychology material, most of which are the only psychological material a number of people are exposed to, just like the content we easily find online. Personality tests, mental illness tests, dream interpretations, or indicators that show when someone is lying or secretly admiring you. Things that are easily contradicted and very ideological. There is also this guy, Sigmund Freud, who went down in histories and textbooks and whose theories are being taught and introduced to young minds at schools because he is the one of the pioneer personalities in the field of psychology. He proposed a number of theories, mostly absurd, like the infamous Oedipus complex, which states that an infant sexually desires its parent of the opposite sex, and these feelings are repressed into the subconscious, as a result of which internal conflicts arise, and that the Oedipus complex, is the key to human nature. That, along with his other contributions, is met with scoffs and violent reactions from scholars. But those materials are actually astrology and pseudopsychology, non-scientific speculation about human behavior. Most of those only run on common sense, on generally accepted ideas about human behavior, and by itself is not sufficient for science. Therefore, we should not confuse it with the science of psychology. Now, moving on to the third reason, some practitioners of psychology are defending their field, arguing that it can be all about biology and the near scientific workings of the mind, and that it is scientifically rigorous, what with many experiments and field studies and quantitative analysis going on. They try too hard to make it look scientific by satisfying the rigorous requirements, striving to be value neutral and perform objective studies. Those arguments add up to the dirt that people put on psychology's name because there is a fault in arguing that psychology is a purely scientific rigorous field when it isn't and it shouldn't be. Objective research is ill equipped to deal with emotion laden topics. Psychology studies the mind and the complexities of human thinking that can't be explained simply by set facts and strict numbers. Psychology is indeed a science, but it isn't purely rigorous. So while all of those 3 points, lack of rigor, the absurdity of pop conflated psychology, and faulty claims of some psychology practitioners are undeniably true, the field is not just that. It is not simply guessing or interpreting behavior. It is not just the notion of lying on a couch, pouring your heart out onto a doctor. Psychology is a big umbrella term for many disciplines with varying focuses. Despite its philosophical and theory-driven nature, it has its empirical and scientific side. The academe should not invalidate it completely because it has aspects that are not as objective and quantifiable as other fields. It is a vast field of expertise, present in more scenarios than we care to know, actually. Clinical psychology and many non-clinical counseling applications are obvious examples. Human resources, too, where psychologists have valuable skills in recruiting, selection, training, and mental health interventions, and market research, among many others. Psychology is a science, complete with the processes of experimentation, research computations, and biochemistry workings. It indeed has sides that are more closely related to social sciences, such as personality, social, counseling, and developmental psychology, but it also has sides that involve the biological and physical sciences of the brain, such as neuropsychology, biopsychology, and quantitative psychology. We can think of psychology as the bridge between biology and sociology, between the perception of human life as organ systems and metabolism, and human life in terms of groups, cultures, and behaviors. Psychology follows scientific and systematic processes to establish facts and perform experiments and case studies ethically to lend as much credibility to the findings as possible. Psychology and the other behavioral or social sciences are not as precise in their measurements as are biology, chemistry, or physics, but to the extent that psychologists use empirical evidence, their findings may be referred to as scientific. It is this emphasis on the empirically observable that made it necessary for psychology to change its definition from the study of the mind to the science of behavior, because the mind itself could not be directly observed. We can directly observe and carefully measure externals, such as what a person does or says and marks down on a psychological test, but we cannot directly observe a person's mind. Through all the trials of psychology to understand human behavior, society has been able to make several advances. A number of mental and behavioral disorders are now treatable, a few actually curable. We found out that we could take vague concepts like depression, alcoholism, and measure them with rigor. We could create a classification of the mental illnesses, that we could understand the causality of mental illnesses. We could look across time at the same people, for example, who were genetically vulnerable to schizophrenia, and ask what the contribution of mothering or genetics are, and we could isolate third variables by doing experiments on the mental illnesses. There are now behavioral interventions used to help those with autism, and best of all, we were able to, in the last 50 years, invent drug treatments and psychological treatments. And when we were able to test them rigorously, throw out the things that didn't work and keep the things that actively did. Psychology undeniably is more difficult to set absolute rules onto and is still a developing field. It has a long way to go before reaching the same reputation as other readily accepted scientific fields, but that doesn't mean it is less deserving of merit. While we should consider all of psychology's shortcomings, we should use those to fill up what needs to be improved, not to show that it is not a science. So, to answer our title, is psychology pseudoscience? No. No, it is not. It is a science that has accomplished many feats and made miserable people less miserable, despite its limitations. That is all. Thank you.